China is fully ready to begin these operations. We're going to see the Taiwan crisis erupt either later this year or next year at the latest. Putin was holding his forces back for some reason, and to me, the most likely reason is he's waiting for China to join the war. This is going to be a simultaneous 2, 3, or even 4-front war if Iran gets involved. North Korea, of course, has 2 super EMP satellites that it could use to take out the U.S. without warning in a matter of minutes. Russia's and China's cyber warfare capabilities are badly underestimated. It's even in national security circles. In the event we get into a war, it's going to launch these kind of disabling cyber and EMP attacks that leave us defenseless. Basically, a third world failed state. Our U.S. military would mostly melt away. If President Biden decides to make good on his pledge to defend Taiwan militarily, it's going to be a World War III situation. All options will be on the table, including a nuclear response.
Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Today on the channel we have a guest we've had on the channel a few times before, David Pynes. He's a former Army Combat Arms Officer and HQ Staff Officer with an MA in National Security Studies from Georgetown University. He currently serves as Deputy Director of National Operations for the EMP Task Force on National and Homeland Security. He just co-authored a book entitled Catastrophe Now: What U.S. Leaders Must Do to Ensure America's Survival. Today, what's going on in the news is a lot of stuff with the China-Taiwan situation. China's launching patrols in the Taiwan Strait, ordering inspections of ships, and Taiwan says that it will not comply. This, of course, is in light of the Taiwanese president's visit to America, where she is currently meeting with the leader of the House, I believe, McCarthy. And of course, this has been an established red line for the Chinese. So what we want to talk about today, some of the capabilities of the Chinese military that a lot of people might not be aware of, as well as hopefully get your assessment of where things are at currently geopolitically. So thanks for coming on once again.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me back on the show.
Yeah, so what is your take on what's going on right now in terms of China establishing red lines with Taiwan over this visit? Where do you see this situation headed?
Well, we've seen this happen repeatedly over the last few decades. The first time they came to memory, I think, was in 95. I think then the then president of Taiwan visited Cornell University, and China responded by 5 missile fires, nuclear-capable missile fires into the Taiwan Straits, and also joint amphibious operations, or rather amphibious training in the Strait. And we responded, President Clinton responded by sending the aircraft carrier battle group of the USS Nimitz through the Taiwan Straits. That's the last time that's happened, by the way. That was in December of 1995. And then we had probably the biggest event was when Speaker Pelosi flew to Taiwan. And as soon as she departed, the Chinese, for the first time ever, conducted a joint air and naval blockade exercise, really demonstrated how they plan to defeat and force Taiwan's surrender. And what they did is they surrounded it on all sides for the first time in history with their ships and naval air forces. So I think that's how we're going to see the Taiwan crisis erupt either later this year or next year at the latest, to take advantage of this window of opportunity that China views that it has with regards to the Biden administration.
So what do you make of this current situation where they're threatening to inspect ships? Have you heard anything about this?
So it was back in August that they declared the Taiwan Straits to be their sovereign waters, and that they would conduct these types of inspections. That normal commercial traffic would still be permitted through the Straits, but it would be subject to these kinds of inspections. So this is the first I've actually heard whether they're actually trying to enforce that since they declared it in August.
Yeah, this just came out today, and of course Taiwan says that they will not comply with this. So this could be the potential flashpoint. I think we very well could see, something escalate from this. I've been doing videos lately where I talk about these mobilization centers that are popping up all around China. Most of them are concentrated just opposite the Taiwan Strait. Have you heard anything about that?
I have. So it was back in May of last year. I interviewed J.R. Nyquist, and he reported on his Chinese sources that were saying that they talked about the leaked video in Guangdong province, in which Chinese generals as well as Communist Party leaders in that province talked about full mobilization for war for the province to include defending the population against air raids, nuclear missile attack, potential submarine deployed U.S. commandos that would try to blow up their nuclear assets, such as nuclear submarines in port, nuclear missiles, and nuclear bomber bases. China continues to fully militarize and mobilize its economy. There have been reports that Chinese business leaders have left the country because they refuse to convert their economic production to military weapons production. I mean, China already has a massive military. They have the largest army in the world, the largest navy, the largest coast guard, and the largest nuclear capable ballistic missile force. They also have 1,500 anti-ship missiles, which are anti-ship ballistic missiles, which are a type of weapon the U.S. does not currently possess.
So I guess the question is, because everybody wants to know, okay, when is the blockade going to start? When is the invasion going to start? The question is China prepared today to do this, or do they need more time to get ready?
So I think that China is, I mean, in my viewpoint, they're fully ready to begin these operations. I have a friend who's he's a retired U.S. Navy commander, and he's talked about, our intel would see some kind of full mobilization of the Chinese fleet before we'd be likely to see this unfurl. But it would likely be some kind of a purported exercise, like another blockade exercise that would convert from a running start to a full blockade.
Yeah, my new saying is there are no military exercises, only World War III disguises. Because right now, you always have to interpret everything, every exercise, as being potentially a real world, because that's likely how it's going to start, just how it started with Russia and Ukraine. So what do you think happens if and when this happens? I mean, let's just kind of be realistic about, okay, so China inspects some Taiwanese ships. The Taiwanese refuse. Shots are fired. And then all of a sudden it's on. What happens to global trade? What happens to U.S.-China relations? I know I'm putting a lot on you right now, but I just want to pick your brain with respect to what do you think could transpire so that we can best prepare ourselves for that eventuality.
Well, there's an interesting book published just recently. It's called 2034, written by Admiral Savaris. And in that book, he talked about the war beginning with, our freedom of navigation sorties, our naval sorties, where we send a couple large surface combatants, destroyers or frigates, even cruisers sometimes, through the Taiwan Straits to really just, poke China in the eye and show them that we're still in our belief at least, the biggest bully in the block.
Mm-hmm.
And he speculates that the war, World War III could start with a Chinese cyber attack that takes out those ships. So it could be a naval attack like that where they take out our ships, because the U.S. has refused to recognize China's declaration that its Taiwan Straits are China's sovereign waters. So we're going to continue to do that. We're going to continue to provoke them, and of course, they don't really need to be provoked, because I think they have a plan to invade and retake Taiwan by the end of 2024. But in terms of how it would unfurl, it would really depend. It depends. I think, as we discussed previously in our last interview, it really depends on President Biden. If President Biden decides to make good on his pledge to defend Taiwan militarily, then I think it's going to be a World War III situation. I think there's going to be a full-scale cyber attack on the U.S. that would likely affect southern Canada as well, perhaps. And it would, the first attack would be against our satellites, and then they would follow up likely with a massive cyber attack on our critical infrastructure. In the event that Biden doesn't, which is my suspicion, given his overall very pro-communist Chinese policies in comparison to his predecessor, I think it's much more likely that Biden would respond with no military response and would respond with large-scale economic sanctions. Of course, the United States is much more entangled economically with China than it is Russia. So I think he's going to have kind of a built-in deterrent to really impose the kind of severe economic sanctions that we've seen him impose against Russia. Because if he does the same thing against China, I mean, it would threaten an economic depression. It could crash our economy. So we probably wouldn't see all of the sanctions unveiled at the same time. It'd probably be more targeted sanctions that he thought would affect China, and then kind of see how it works out from there. But of course, China's going to retaliate, and they could, stop supplying us. And would, of course, stop supplying us with life-saving pharmaceuticals, for which they provide almost 90% of life-saving pharmaceuticals to the U.S. and various other products, rare earths, of course, that are militarily useful and are actually required for advanced weapons production.
So you're saying that the current administration is more lenient in terms of Chinese policy, foreign policy. However, it seems that since Biden came into office, the tension between China and the U.S. has escalated immensely. When Trump was in office, during the whole COVID thing, you couldn't even really criticize China, it seemed. Now, it seems like you're even allowed to criticize lab leak, and all of a sudden you're starting to see the anti-Chinese government, communist sentiment increasing. So I'm trying to wrap my head around, what would a different government be able to do? Because either you're going to put sanctions on or you're going to confront them militarily. Both, it seems, are going to end in disaster. One, obviously, much quicker. So what is a administration to do about this current quagmire with Taiwan?
Chinese move on Taiwan is not deterrable. There's really nothing we can do to deter it. It's just a question of whether we manage the end of the conflict peacefully with a reunification agreement, whether we opt for economic war, or whether we try to go to war and most likely lose badly.
Yeah, I don't foresee too many outcomes where that's favorable for us. Now, in terms of some of the stuff that you talk about in your new book, you go into a lot of depth about Chinese military capabilities as it pertains to their nuclear capabilities that I think a lot of people are unaware of. And this is part of the problem, is with the Great Chinese Firewall, we don't know exactly what they have. And it's just really, open source intelligence gathering is usually skimpy as is, but when you're talking about China, it's even worse. So what can you tell us about their true nuclear capabilities and how that might differ from what people commonly believe?
Yeah, so back in 1997, I wrote a never published book called American Danger, the increasing existential threat from a Sino-Russian nuclear attack on the U.S. And essentially, I was already reporting and writing about Chinese plans for a massive crash nuclear weapons program. And so that's been underway for a long time. We didn't hear about it until July of 2021 with these additional 360 DF-41 10 warhead ICBM silos, but it's actually been going on for some time. And I think you and I discussed in some email exchanges prior to the show that China has what's referred to as its Great Underground Wall. It has 3,000 miles of tunnels, which serve multiple purposes. One of the purposes of which is, of course, nuclear war survivability, but also concealing what we believe to be likely several hundred, at least, nuclear weapons, most likely mounted on road mobile ICBMs or rail mobile ICBMs which they can truck out in the event of a crisis. And suddenly, their actual capabilities could increase exponentially, certainly much higher than 400. But the problem is we have U.S. intelligence community is very much biased for reasons unknown to me in favor of China, and they've continually underestimated the size of the Chinese nuclear arsenal by a factor of about 4. So when we talk about 400, the actual number is likely around 1,600 today that I estimate. So they actually have more nuclear weapons than we do, certainly, and likely more strategic nuclear weapons than we do as well at this point. But once their nuclear buildup is complete, they'll likely have between 4,000 to 5,000 strategic nuclear warheads, which, by way of comparison, the U.S. only has 1,515 at this point. When I worked in D.C., I met with the National Nuclear Security Administration chief. I sat next to him during a meeting with various think tank heads. He told me that we had 7,000 strategic nuclear weapons deployed at that time, back in 2003.
Yeah, these tunnels are interesting to me. A lot of these were Cold War tunnels, correct? Or are they still building new ones that you know of?
Well, I think they started. We know that they started the underground bunker program back in Mao's time, and probably by the late 1960s, they began constructing nuclear blast shelters to protect them mainly against U.S. attack, but perhaps also against the potential Soviet attack. And I think this underground system, I think it was unveiled about 10 years ago. So I think it's mostly complete. I'm not aware of any additional construction in the past 10 years in that area. China also has a military central committee command center that's underground by about 2,500 feet. And that is likely capable of withstanding a direct nuclear hit. Our largest nuclear missile warheads are about 550 kilotons. We do have the B-83, which is a gravity bomb, which is about 1.3 megatons, but Biden's reportedly trying to get rid of those.
Yeah, I can only imagine what such a centralized planning structure where you have unlimited human resources and resources could accomplish in a short period of time when it comes to a military build-out of that scale and scope. I think we probably aren't even really scratching the surface of what they could potentially have because, of course, we don't know, right? And
yeah, I mean, this is unlike Russia, China has been very secretive of the size of its nuclear arsenal. It's never released true figures. It's claimed 300 warheads for the past 3+ decades, and its manufacturing base is now twice the size of America's, and reportedly it's capable of producing advanced weapon systems 5 to 6 times faster.
Yeah, and I would venture to say it's probably bigger than twice, if I'm, because pretty much everything is made there. So I presume that twice is probably an understatement. But I'd like to get your thoughts on tech also, because I think not many people are talking about how artificial intelligence and social media is going to factor into this. The TikTok thing strikes me as very important. I view it as like a one-way mirror. It's like the West is in a room and China's in a room. China can see in to our room, but we can't see into theirs. And with this TikTok algorithm, they can basically dictate what we see here, what we squabble over. It can be a very divisive algorithm. It can be very time-consuming. It can dumb down the population. I mean, the list goes on. So for me, above and beyond all the spy stuff that's associated with it, this strikes me as a big problem. So do you think that TikTok is going to be banned? And what about AI? How do you think that factors into all of this? Because this is something which will absolutely be integrated into military systems at the decision-making level at some point. And when it does, it could be the determining factor.
Yeah, we're already seeing drones, Chinese and Russian military drones with incorporated AI. Russia's newest Poseidon underwater unmanned vehicle is with 100 megaton warheads reportedly has AI that kind of allows it to pre-program and trail, kind of navigate on its own, and then of course it only detonates based on Russian military command. But yeah, TikTok is a huge problem. It was really just dumbfounding after the Chinese military balloon had circumnavigated the entire country, including parts of southern Canada or western Canada, I guess. Before it was shot down, Korean Jean-Pierre told the U.S. The press conference that I guess the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan had released a TikTok trying to explain why it wasn't a big deal that the Chinese balloon circumnavigated the entire country before they shot it down. And the irony of that was they were trying to downplay a Chinese spy and surveillance balloon on a Chinese spy and surveillance platform. So I thought that was really underscored the whole level of ignorance by even the national security experts, within the Biden administration in terms of, just really appeasing China on multiple levels. And, Biden, of course, was asked shortly after the balloon incident, is this going to affect U.S. relations with China? He's like, no, our relations are great. That's obviously a huge difference with the Trump administration. The Trump administration would have shot the balloon down, back when it was over the Aleutian Islands, and they wouldn't have apologized for it. They wouldn't have tried to downplay and lie to the American people, as unfortunately we've seen with this administration.
You talk a lot about cyber attack. Now, we've seen some cyber attacks that have been larger in scale, like there was one on the gas production facility in the United States. I believe that was in 2022 and possibly 2021. We've seen the solar
2021, yeah.
Yeah, SolarWinds hack as well. I mean, we haven't seen any. I know there was an attack from the Russians on the Ukrainian nuclear facility back in like 2016 or something. What do you think the real capabilities are? Are they over-exaggerated in terms of what you can accomplish with a cyber attack? Or have the countries just yet to use their best cyber weapons?
Yeah, I think Russia demonstrated it could shut down most of Ukraine's grid. It did so in 2015, but I think that Russia's and China's cyber warfare capabilities are badly underestimated in the U.S., even in U.S. national security circles. And the reasons that Russia hasn't decided to unleash its full cyber capabilities in Ukraine, for example, are certainly debatable. I think that they likely don't want to show how quickly they could take us out with cyber, take out the U.S. and NATO and kind of render us militarily ineffective. In terms of likelihood, that's the greatest threat. Super EMP is the greatest threat in terms of the amount of people that would die from a super EMP attack. But I think even almost more than nuclear, because nuclear weapons are targeted against, Washington, D.C. and our military bases that have nuclear weapons, and our nuclear missile systems and bomber bases, submarine bases. But cyber is the most likely mode of attack that's going to occur in the next war.
It seems as though a lot of these cyber weapons are used to either delay or interfere or buy time, as opposed to like permanently cripple. Are you aware of what type of cyber attacks would take place? Is we just talking about like denial of service, which is something which is limited, right? Like it only can last for, you hear about how the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense website is down, but then of course it always comes back on. What would this look like? What would the kinetic outcome be of a real deal crippling cyber attack?
Well, of course, as you alluded to, there's more than one type of cyber attack. There's, obviously viruses, and there's also denial of service. I think we'd see a lot. Initially, it'd be mainly denial of service, something you can turn on and off. And I've also speculated, I've been writing an article I haven't published yet in the National Interest, but about the possibility of Russian or Chinese cyber blackmail, where they really go full bore on their cyber attack against the U.S., shut down our power, communications, internet, financial sector, so that people can't get money from the bank, and the gas pumps don't work. Really just shutting down our economy, and then kind of presenting us with an ultimatum. And the ultimatum could be fairly reasonable. Could be something like, what Russia asked for their mutual security treaty of December of 2021, or it could be much worse. It could be, okay, you need to disarm of all your nukes. I speculate in the article that I'm writing that they could simply say you have to de-alert all your nuclear weapons. So in other words, no ICBMs on alert. Our bombers are already off alert. Over two-thirds of our submarines, 10 of our 14 nuclear missile submarines are off alert. So we could have no nuclear missile submarines sailing from port. And without being able to leave port, we can barely touch Russia and China. The range of our submarine-launched ballistic missiles is such that it only is able to reach just the outskirts of Russia and China. It couldn't reach Moscow, couldn't reach Beijing, couldn't reach their nuclear missile bases. So that alone, if we could, had our nuclear missile submarines de-alerted, I mean, that would really cripple the credibility of our nuclear deterrent, especially if our ICBMs were taken off alert, as some have advocated.
So is it safe to say then that a cyber attack could be used in the initial phases of like a first strike in order to jam our ability to respond?
Yeah, I mean, we'd see electromagnetic, or rather radio frequency jammers. We would see anti-satellite weapons. We'd see cyber attacks on satellites, cyber attacks against our critical infrastructure. So it'd be multifaceted, the type of attacks, but it most likely would not include nuclear or EMP weapons on day one of the conflict, but it likely would include all those weapons on the first day of the war. In fact, I recently listened to Senate Armed Services Committee and House Armed Services Committee meetings with the leaders of the U.S. military, both the Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. A number of the senators and congressmen actually stated that they knew that within the first 2 hours of the war, we'd lose all of our satellites. So that obviously that meant that they'd been briefed to that. I previously had been told by a former nuclear war planner I'm friends with here in Utah, that is a former Air Force major. He said that in all of the war games he participated in kind of the 2000s, the U.S. lost all of our satellites within the first 6 hours. So obviously Russia's and China's capabilities to take out our satellites have improved substantially since then.
That's interesting because that would not necessarily elicit a nuclear response, right? Like if we, unofficially, whatever, declared war or it was on, if we started targeting each other's satellites, that's not necessarily going to immediately trigger us to launch our nukes or them to launch their nukes. I think a lot of people just presume, okay, it's just going to start with nuclear weapons, but no, it starts at the level of cyber, satellite, maybe EMP, then nuclear. And none of those necessarily, there's plausible deniability with some, but none of them necessarily is going to immediately necessitate a nuclear response. Could you talk a little bit about how we go from, okay, Russia takes out one of our satellites to like, what's our move then after that?
Well, I mean, there have been conflicting signals by the Biden administration. As the war in Ukraine broke out, he articulated, I think, 15 or 16 different areas of U.S. critical infrastructure that if Russia were to attack or disable, that, essentially all options will be on the table, including a nuclear response. But then again, we have Presidential Decision Directive 60, essentially is replaced our policy of launch on warning and winning it and be able to fight and win a nuclear war to one of what I call launch on impact, which essentially says that unless we've had two different means of national technical means such as ground radar stations and satellites detecting a nuclear impact on U.S. soil, we wouldn't launch a retaliatory strike. The problem with that is the first impact on U.S. soil is inevitably going to be Washington, D.C. There's no scenario I'm aware of that Russia and China would employ strategic nuclear weapons and not take DC out on as the first impact, or at least simultaneous with multiple impacts on the U.S. and our nuclear missile silos and submarine bases and bomber bases. But then, then on the other hand, we have Russia. Their nuclear doctrine says that if the U.S. attacks or disables their critical infrastructure that has to do with nuclear command and control, that triggers a nuclear response. So we have, on their side, it's very explicit, but in the U.S. side, Biden he's really, I think, the most anti-nuke president we've ever had. Reportedly, he wanted to convert to a sole-use military doctrine, which said that the U.S. would only employ nuclear weapons if the U.S. or its allies were attacked with nukes. So that, for example, in an EM, I guess, at least in a cyber situation or a space warfare situation, as you articulated, then under a sole-use doctrine, the U.S. would not respond to nuclear weapons in either of those circumstances.
Very interesting. So what do you make of the suspension of the New START treaty? The U.S. and Russia are now not sharing information about the position of various strategic forces. And you also have the deployment of tactical and possibly strategic nukes to Belarus. Among other things, I think before last time we talked, Putin wasn't considered an international war criminal yet. Now, of course, the International Criminal Court has a warrant out for his arrest. So we have all of these data points of escalation. What's your take on where we're at with respect to that conflict?
Well, I think that Russia has really been violating New START pretty egregiously over the past, almost since it was signed, to be honest. But particularly in the last 3 years, they've denied any inspections since 2020, late 2020, I believe. So, on one level, it doesn't change much. I think Russia's already been breaking out of New START, but now it basically just gives them the cover. And basically they're telling us they're breaking out from New START with this suspension. Because there's literally, for the first time in over 50 years, there's not a single nuclear arms control treaty which, other than the test ban treaty, that constrains our adversaries' nuclear capabilities in any way. Now, of course, there never has been with China. There never has been with North Korea, despite what Trump, led us to believe that, the North Korean nuclear threat just went away overnight after he engaged in a kind of a propaganda visit with Kim Jong-un rather. We have 2,000 nuclear weapons in reserve. We have a strategic reserve with 2,000 strategic nuclear weapons and 50 tactical nuclear weapons for exactly this type of geopolitical contingency as a hedge to guard against. And that is, Russia is likely, in the process of massively increasing their nuclear arsenal, but China, of course, everyone admits, is in the process of likely, quadrupling the size of its nuclear arsenal since 2021. The U.S. nuclear arsenal is really based on what we viewed the Russian nuclear threat to be in 2010, and China wasn't even part of the equation.
What's your take on the Belarusian situation with respect to moving? What is the purpose of moving tactical nukes there, and do you believe that this really is the start of World War III?
So while I think it's probably correct that most Russian non-strategic nuclear weapons are in storage depots, in this situation where Russia's invaded Ukraine, they had forces pre-positioned all in 2021 in Belarus. I can guarantee you they had nuclear weapons there. So this is really just a formal pronouncement. It's just kind of really upping the ante. It's more strategic signaling than anything else, because the U.S., of course, has never stopped deploying our nuclear warheads in throughout Western Europe. Currently stationed in 5 different Western European countries. So the idea that Russian stationing of nuclear weapons in Belarus is unacceptable, and it's something that no one does. As Putin himself rightly said, we've been doing it for decades. long after the collapse of the Soviet Union.
So, yeah, I mean, I've thought about that, how a lot of these announcements, it seems very poor military planning to announce that you're going to do something before you do it, unless, you were trying to make a threat and for a deterrence utility. But like you're saying, now when they say, oh, we're talking about sending tanks, or we're talking about sending planes, or okay, well, now we've got the tanks and we're ready to put them in, I'm always thinking 2 steps ahead. And I'm just assuming they're already there. Or because, why would they telegraph that? Because it would obviously give the opportunity for, this is a war. So you'd presume that you wouldn't want to announce that you were doing something until it was already there. Even the announcement of depleted uranium, why would they even say that? Why would they why would they make that public, that they were going to be using depleted uranium?
Well, the U.S., of course, has announced that we're not sending tanks armed with depleted uranium shells. It's the British that have confirmed that they will be sending depleted uranium shells.
Yeah, but why would they ever say that? Why would they feel the need to say that?
So it's like you said, it's kind of a game. There's strategic signaling. It's like upping the ante and trying to pressure Russia to back down in Ukraine. And there's at the same time there's the Biden administration sometimes tries to minimize what they're doing to avoid potential Russian nuclear escalation. Or escalate a direct war against NATO. So it's kind of a delicate mix, and we don't always coordinate here in NATO. We have kind of opposing signals every once in a while, but the overall Biden administration plan when the war began essentially was to do incremental escalations of our military assistance to Ukraine for the exact reason to avoid potential Russian nuclear escalation, which I think they rightly considered to be a very real threat. Mm-hmm. It still is, by the way.
How do you see this war going? Do you see this escalating into a broader conflict, or how do you see the situation coming to an end? Is it going to end at a negotiation table, or is this going to blow up? Because right now, all we're hearing is about the Wagner forces in Bakhmut. You're not hearing about a whole lot of stuff happening anywhere else. At least along the front line, it's relatively stable. So it makes me wonder if the Russians are holding a lot of their forces in reserve in anticipation of a broader conflict.
Well, I think that's exactly the risk, is that, it seems to me that, and it has seemed to me for a while, that Putin was holding his forces back for some reason. And to me, the most likely reason is he's waiting for China to join the war. Condoleezza Rice actually publicly stated that U.S. intelligence had intercepted signs that not only was China planning to send lethal assistance to Russia to win the war in Ukraine, but they're actually considering joining the war on Russia's side. So that to me seems unlikely. But the very fact that the U.S. had intercepted intelligence indicating that President Xi was openly considering joining the war against Ukraine to help Russia defeat it, suggests that he may be on the verge of a move in Taiwan as well. So I think that's, of all the likely explanations, I think that's the most likely. The other potential explanation that Russia's holding back its 300 to 500,000 reserve troops that they recently mobilized is that they just want to keep fighting a war of attrition, which they know they'll win. The Biden administration behind the scenes has clearly stated, has told President Zelensky in Ukraine that we can't afford to keep up the level of military assistance, giving them as many weapons of our weapons and munitions as we've been giving them, because we just don't have the production capabilities, and we're really degrading the capabilities of the U.S. military, kind of cannibalizing the U.S. military to support Ukraine and its border conflict against a territorial dispute against Russia. And this whole war in Ukraine is being fought over a patch of territory which is the same size as Lithuania or Latvia. So if you think of would the U.S. and Canada want to start World War III to defend Latvia or Lithuania? It's really the same. I mean, they are at least NATO members, and we at least have some kind of security agreement that theoretically obligates us to defend them. But in the case of Ukraine, we have no such commitment, and we're risking the destruction of the U.S. and NATO, which could happen within the first day of the war, of any direct war with Russia, over a country that we have no security commitment to. And really, frankly, if Russia were to keep all the territory it's annexed, it would have no security impact whatsoever on the U.S. or NATO at all.
Yeah, I mean, there might be, I've always speculated that there's implications for global finance because as the U.S. weakens its stronghold over these regions, obviously Ukraine is the tip of the spear. That puts a lot of downward pressure on the dollar as people start to divest. Obviously, they're going to anyways now because of what happened with the Russian assets being seized and the being kicked off the SWIFT system and all that stuff. So we're already seeing the de-dollarization happening. But I like what you say about the synchronization theory, about how the Chinese and the Russians are perhaps trying to synchronize their activities with respect to maybe waiting to see what happens with Taiwan before going all in and really, committing themselves to the fight in Ukraine. And obviously there was a very unusually warm winter, which was prohibitive of the Russians making the advance that they probably could have made if the ground was frozen. We also had this meeting with Xi Jinping and Putin since we last spoke. What is your take on that? What do you think the purpose of that was?
Well, I think it was to show for President Xi to show solidarity with President Putin. I mean, President Putin is obviously China's most important ally. I mean, both countries, their alliance provides each other strategic depth they wouldn't otherwise have. If Russia were a U.S. ally, for example, China would be very isolated today. If China were, not an enemy, Russia wouldn't its economy would have suffered a great deal if China hadn't told them that they had Russia's back with their no limits partnership that they declared that President Xi basically said was even greater than alliance on February 4th of 2022 at the Beijing Olympics. So I think that was really the main thing. But yeah, it was interesting that the comment that President Xi said as he was leaving Moscow and said a very warm goodbye to President Putin, and he basically said, we're working together. We're reordering the international order in our favor to a greater degree than we've seen since in over a century internationally. So what happened a century ago? The U.S. defeated and crushed Imperial Germany at the end of World War I, and occupied it and really made it defenseless and prostrate. I think that's really what China and Russia, especially China, has planned for the U.S. is that in the event we get into a war, it's going to launch these kind of disabling cyber and EMP attacks that leave us defenseless, without basically a third world failed state, without an army or an armed forces that's able, really to function. Because I think our U.S. military would mostly melt away in the wake of a super EMP attack as members of the military went home to their families to try to defend them against roving gangs and just to prevent them from starving in place. And that's essentially what we saw happen to a lesser extent at the end of World War I, where Germany's armies had essentially been victorious on the battlefield, and with the exception of a brief small part of Alsace-Lorraine, had no enemy troops occupying any of their territory. But with news of their immediate family members starving to death in late 1917, especially in late 1918, they began to desert. And any Christmas leave or something like that, where they go to their families, they just never would come back.
Interesting. So I know last time your hypothesis was that Putin met with Xi Jinping before the invasion, and that was to basically work out what they were about to do. So do you think that there was any discussion about what the next move is going to be? I guess what I'm trying to get out of you is, what do you think is going to happen in the next few months? Because I was talking to a financial analyst recently, and his theory was that in the next 6 months, we're going to see more change than we have in the last 50 years, was his overall assessment. What do you see happening in 6 months on the ground? And obviously, I don't expect you to have a crystal ball or anything. It's, purely hypothetical. But where do you see this war going, and how can we prepare for what's coming?
Well, I think Russia holds almost all the cards in the war in Ukraine. I mean, they're winning the war essentially. They accomplished almost all of their military objectives by September of last year, and that's why Russia has been offering a ceasefire ever since, an armistice agreement to end the war, saying that they could complete or achieve their remaining objectives through diplomatic means alone. But with this massive force of at least 300,000, perhaps even 500,000 troops that are massing on Ukraine's borders, Russia can unleash those, and in the Bakhmut area and in the Donbass, the Battle of the Donbass, Ukraine has been suffering, by my estimations, almost 3 times as many killed and wounded militarily than the Russians have. So at this point, I think I assess they've suffered about 40% total casualties out of their million-man army. And eventually, they're unable to mobilize almost any other troops, because they've already mobilized all of their troops, all their military fighting age men, ages 18 to 50. So they're actually having to go under 18, and over 50 in order to meet their manpower requirements. So that's something that suggests that they couldn't, if the Russians were to essentially double or even triple the size of their military in Ukraine, I don't think Ukraine could effectively defend their territory to that, and they probably lose about a third of their country, if not half of their country, within a matter of 3 to 6 months.
It's really hard to know what to believe, right? Because both sides are giving you a completely different perspective about what's going on. According to the Ukrainians, it's their ratio is much higher than the Russians. It's 3 dead Russians for every Ukrainian. You ask the Scott Ritter crowd, well, it's 3 dead, or it's 10 dead Ukrainians for every Russian. So, and the footage, it's so hard to determine what is actually going on. The fog of war is so thick that, we just have to, I guess, see exactly how it pans out. Now, some of the things. Oh, did you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, I did. So General Kellogg on Fox News a couple months ago, he basically stated that Ukrainians have told him straight up behind the scenes that they'd lost 100,000 troops dead up to that point. We have really the public pronunciations where Biden is saying fight till the last Ukrainian, essentially. And then behind the scenes, he's saying we can't continue supporting you past the summer. So you need to take back as much territory as possible, because we're gonna meet the Russians. You guys are gonna have to end the war on the negotiating table. So Ukrainians are telling us the truth behind the scenes, but in public, all the British propaganda and U.S. propaganda organs are just parroting what the Ukrainians are saying publicly, which is that the Russians are getting killed off massively every day. Thousands more Russian troops dead or wounded, when in fact it's almost the opposite.
Now, just to wrap up, we haven't really spoke a lot about what's going on in North Korea, but I think since the last time we spoke, they had a military parade where they unveiled just massive amounts of these very large ICBMs. And of course, now it appears as though the tension is at an all-time high on the peninsula. You got U.S. nuclear bombers in the region. You got the Nimitz aircraft carrier there. They're launching missiles every single day. What is the purpose of that escalation as it pertains to the Chinese. It almost seems as though the North Koreans are doing the talking for the Chinese. It's almost like they're like the puppet of, that the war is kind of being fought on that peninsula. The Chinese are using the North Koreans as a conduit for maybe the military aspect of this conflict.
Yeah, I think that's always been the case ever since, of course, after the Korean War, North Korea effectively became a Chinese puppet state. China, of course, having saved its bacon, North Korea wouldn't even exist were it not for Chinese military intervention in 1951 to push the U.S. back from the Yalu River back to the South Korean border. Yeah, I definitely think that that's the case, and I think that I think the thing to remember is that North Korea is not going to invade South Korea. It's not going to attack the U.S. unless China authorizes them to. So wouldn't be a one-off. It wouldn't be like, oh, North Korea is invading South Korea and China's just watching. It'd be like this is going to be a simultaneous 2, 3, or even 4-front war if Iran gets involved, in which China is going to maximize its advantage of having more than one front, so the U.S. can respond effectively militarily. So I can't really overstate how important it is for Biden to stay out of this war, stay out of the invasion of Chinese invasion of and blockade of Taiwan. Because if he gets involved, China will absolutely unleash North Korea. North Korea, of course, has two super EMP satellites that it could use to take out the U.S. Without warning in a matter of minutes. And we wouldn't even know which country attacked us, most likely. The bottom line is, the U.S. won the Cold War by default, really. We didn't really win it. It's just that the Soviets collapsed and allowed us to assimilate Eastern Europe into NATO. And so we have this huge alliance system, and our enemies will let us keep those allies, our formal treaty allies. They're willing to let us keep those allies. But if we defend outside of our alliance perimeter into their spheres of influence in Ukraine and Taiwan, all bets are off. And they, our allies on the front lines will likely be the first to destroy. Eastern European countries, Finland, Poland, countries like that will be the first to get wiped out in the event of all-out shooting war with Russia. And then, of course, with regards to China, Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, and perhaps even Australia and New Zealand would be the first to get wiped out as well. So, the best thing we can do for the U.S. and Canada is to pursue a more defensive national security strategy, which seeks to defend U.S. treaty allies instead of trying to go beyond that and defend countries halfway across the world we have no formal security commitment with.
Yeah, I think the definition of defense is always becoming more and more offensive and preventative, right? That's just the nature of defensive lines, as they want to expand, even though it ultimately amounts to taking preemptive action against countries that you perceive to be a threat. So our Department of Defense tends to be engaged in a lot of offensive operations around the world. But like you say, if we perhaps restructure, and we'll probably have no other choice. One of the things you talk about in your write-up is how the efficiency of Chinese military budgets compared to the American military budget is far superior. They get something like 3 times the bang for their buck because we have such a bloated military industrial complex. I think that's important for people to realize that while our budget might encompass the next 10 countries and overshadow the next 10 countries combined, that we're not spending that money efficiently.
Well, it's more than that. So we're led to believe that China, even the DoD apparently believes China's official budget is accurate of $230 billion a year. if you extrapolate that, that's only 1.2% of their GDP. Never in human history has a communist country only spent 1% of its GDP on its military. During Soviet times, I think it was 6 to 7, maybe even 8% or 9% of GDP was spent on defense, right up until the end of the Soviet Union. And they had the largest military in the world. Their armed forces were nearly 4 million men under arms at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed. They were spending 7 to 9%. Most like, we're spending 3.3% of GDP here in the U.S. And if you extrapolate that to if you believe it as I do, China is spending at least that much and probably much more on the defense, then that would equate to a defense budget of over $1 trillion. So it's not, and that's in PPP equivalent, granted. So what we believe they're spending in dollar terms is actually most likely at least 3 times, maybe 4 or 5 times higher than that. But you're right. The Heritage Foundation did a study and said that China was getting 20 times more bang for its buck than the U.S. Just in terms of equivalent weapon systems and capabilities. And I mean I think that's really obvious because the massive military they have, the fact they have a larger army, navy, coast guard, nuclear capable ballistic missile force, and so many other areas really wouldn't be possible if they were only spending a fraction of our budget. So the whole idea that the U.S. spends more than the next 10 countries combined is really wrong and stupid, and it's very naive and ignorant. And I think we need to put that to bed because it's guaranteed that China's spending more than we are in PPP equivalent terms.
Yeah, obviously there's secrecy with respect to how much they spend, but there's also the fact that, what are they counting as military, right? There might be all these auxiliary functions of other government branches that might perform a lot of, like, that might be calculated into what we would lump into our defense budget, but maybe they don't count that as officially within their defense budget. So, yeah, I mean, plus they have the factories right there. It's all centralized. There's none of this private contracts with whoever. So yeah, I think, and of course they're not as spread out, they're not trying to police the waterways of every major waterway in the world. So, is there anything else that, we've pretty much covered all the bases as usual. Is there anything else that you wanted to make note of with respect to the current events and with respect to what people should be aware of when it comes to military capabilities of major superpowers?
Yeah, I think, further to your last point, the fact that the U.S. is spread out militarily across the world, that's really a big disadvantage. I mean, we're trying to police every area of the world, but we have no strategic focus. There's no real grand strategy. It's just liberal hegemony. And we really need to, we should have a much more focused strategy. It could be focusing military resources in Asia. I think we do better to focus on strategic defense, homeland defense. That's an area where we're hugely lacking. We could have a conventional military 10 times larger and greater and more powerful than Russia and China combined, but they could still take us out with super EMP, cyber, and even a nuclear first strike, which in my estimation, with the recent Putin declaration that he's deploying Poseidon torpedo submarines to the Pacific, they could likely take out all but maybe 40 of our strategic nuclear warheads. And with 10,000 ABMs, they could easily take those out. So they're getting to the point where they could be almost oblivious to even a full-scale nuclear exchange, assuming Russian, Chinese nuclear first strike and U.S. only a second strike retaliation. But if your listeners would like to, or your viewers rather, would like to learn more about some of these topics we've discussed, I'd really encourage them to go to Amazon and you can look up my name or Peter Pry's name, and you'll see that our newest book, Catastrophe Now, is also written by Cynthia Ayers, our executive director that replaced Peter. And I think it'll talk about a lot of these alarming things, and I would encourage your viewers to share those with U.S. and Canadian leaders to help them understand what we're really facing and why it's so incredibly important for us to pursue peace, peaceful coexistence with Russia and China instead of a policy that's provoking an unnecessary third world war.
Cynthia Ayers, what is her background?
She has a background in national security community, and she's worked in U.S. intelligence, I think, for a couple decades.
Okay, cool.
And I also wanted to add that I'd encourage all of your viewers to subscribe to my Substack at dpyne.substack.com. It's the Real War newsletter, and I try to provide weekly updates on the national security threats we're facing.
I'll post a link to the book in the comment. I'm going to pin the top comment so we can get some people getting that book. I know it's going to be very eye-opening for a lot of people. We've barely scratched the surface of, you sent me the abridged version of the portion of the book that you wrote, and it's just very densely packed with information. And it's, very, very compelling and interesting stuff. And I would encourage people to go check out your YouTube channel as well. Let's get you up to 10,000 subscribers, and hopefully you can start releasing more current events analysis stuff, because I think now's the time that we need that sort of independent geopolitical analyst more than ever. But thanks again for coming on, and we hope to see you back here in the future.
Yeah, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Take care.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.